December 3, 1944, Camp McCain, Mississippi. The transport truck lurched to a stop outside a cluster of wooden barracks, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Inge Mueller pressed her face against the canvas covering, catching her first glimpse of America through a gap in the fabric. Pine trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their branches heavy with strange moss that hung like gray curtains in the humid air. This was nothing like the America she had been taught to fear. It was quieter, greener, and somehow more unsettling than the industrial wasteland of enemy territory she had imagined. The canvas flap pulled back, revealing a tall American officer with kind eyes that seemed wrong for a captor. Captain James Holloway stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his uniform crisp, despite the oppressive southern heat that seemed to persist even in December. Behind him, a young private with sandy hair and nervous hands waited to help the prisoners down from the truck. 23 German women climbed out slowly, their auxiliary uniforms stained and wrinkled from weeks of transport across the Atlantic, and then by rail through American cities they could not name. Inge's legs trembled as her boots hit Mississippi soil for the first time. She had been a supply clerk in Leipzig, managing inventory for the Wehrmacht with efficiency that had earned her commendations. Now she was a prisoner of war in a country she had been taught to hate, standing among strangers who should have been her tormentors. But the American captain was speaking in calm, measured tones, his voice carrying none of the cruelty she had been warned to expect. Beside her, 19-year-old Rosa Klein clutched a small photograph of her family in Nuremberg, her fingers white against the edges. The youngest among them, Rosa had joined the Auxiliary Corps barely a year earlier, believing she was helping defend her homeland. Now her wide eyes reflected confusion and fear as American soldiers gestured for the women to form a line. On Inge's other side stood Mathilde Hoffmann, whom everyone called Tilly. At 27, she was the oldest and most experienced, a veteran auxiliary from Berlin who had seen more of the war than any of them. Her jaw was set with the same military bearing she had maintained since their capture in France 3 months earlier. The women were led into a large mess hall, and what happened next would become the moment that changed everything. The room was warm, almost uncomfortably so after the cold transport. Long tables had been set with metal trays, and the smell that filled the air made Inge's stomach clench with unexpected hunger. It was rich and savory, carrying hints of herbs she could not identify and something else, something that smelled impossibly like comfort itself. An African-American woman in a white apron emerged from the kitchen carrying an enormous pot. She was older, perhaps in her late 30s, with strong hands and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. Coralie Mae Washington ladled chicken and dumplings into each metal bowl with practiced efficiency, her movements carrying the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime feeding people. She moved down the line of German prisoners, meeting each pair of surprised eyes with a warmth that seemed to soften the tension in the room. When she reached Inge, she paused for just a moment, offering a small nod that somehow conveyed understanding beyond language barriers. Inge stared at the bowl placed before her. Steam rose from fluffy dumplings floating in thick, golden broth, studded with chunks of tender chicken and vegetables. The aroma was overwhelming after months of thin soups and hard bread during their transport. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the spoon, aware that every woman at the table was experiencing the same disorienting moment. This was not how enemies were supposed to treat prisoners. Rosa Klein sat across from her, tears streaming silently down her young face as she took her first bite. The 19-year-old had not cried once during their capture, not during the Atlantic crossing, not during the uncertain journey through America. But this simple act of culinary kindness had broken through her carefully maintained composure. She chewed slowly, as if trying to memorize the taste of something she had never expected to experience in captivity. Tilly Hoffmann, ever the practical one, ate with measured deliberation. But Inge noticed how her fellow Berliner's jaw tightened with each spoonful, how her eyes kept darting toward the American soldiers standing guard around the mess hall. Tilly had been the one to warn them during transport that American propaganda would try to weaken their resolve, that they should expect psychological tactics designed to make them betray their homeland. But she had never mentioned that those tactics might involve dumpling dough so tender it melted on the tongue, or chicken so perfectly seasoned it tasted like someone's grandmother had prepared it with care. Captain Holloway stood near the kitchen entrance, observing the scene with an expression Ing could not quite read. Beside him, a young soldier with kind eyes watched nervously, his hand resting on his rifle, but his posture suggesting he had no intention of using it. This was Private First Class Henry Lawson, though Ing would not learn his name until later. He looked barely older than Rosa, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of farming before soldiering. The meal continued in near silence, broken only by the soft sounds of eating and the occasional whispered German conversation. Ing found herself taking smaller and smaller bites, trying to make the experience last. Each spoonful seemed to contradict another piece of propaganda she had absorbed over the years. Americans were supposed to be cruel, wasteful, barbaric. They were not supposed to serve food that tasted like comfort, like home, like someone actually cared whether you were hungry. When Coralie May returned to collect the empty bowls, she paused at Inga's table. In halting, careful English that Inga barely understood, the cook said something that sounded like a question. Ing shook her head helplessly, and Coralie May smiled with infinite patience before gesturing to the bowl and giving a thumbs up. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt surreal in its normalcy. Each morning, the German women woke to reveille, played on an American bugle, dressed in the same auxiliary uniforms they had worn across the ocean, and lined up for breakfast in the mess hall, where Coralie May presided over her kitchen like a benevolent general. The food continued to arrive in quantities that seemed impossible, given the rationing Inge had experienced throughout the war. Eggs, grits swimming in butter, biscuits that flaked apart at the slightest touch, and always coffee, rich and dark and endless. Inge found herself drawn to the kitchen during free periods, watching through the serving window as Coralie May worked. The cook moved with the efficiency of someone who had been feeding people her entire life, chopping vegetables with rhythmic precision, stirring pots with one hand while seasoning with the other. She caught Inge watching on the third day and, instead of shooing her away, gestured for her to come closer. What began as simple observation evolved into something more profound. Coralie May pulled out a worn recipe card and pointed to the words written in flowing cursive script, "Chicken and dumplings." She spoke each word slowly, exaggerating the sounds, then pointed to the ingredients laid out on her workspace. Ing repeated the words hesitantly, her German accent making the English syllables feel strange and unwieldy in her mouth. But Coralie May's face lit up with encouragement, and she continued, pointing to flour, to chicken, to butter, teaching not just words but the language of nourishment itself. Private First Class Henry Lawson discovered this informal education during his rounds and, rather than reporting it as fraternization, he joined in. The young Tennessean had grown up on a farm where his mother had taught him that food was love made visible, and he recognized something universal happening in Coralie May's kitchen. He began bringing simple children's books from the camp library, pointing to pictures and speaking the corresponding words. Apple, bread, home, family. Rosa Klein was the first to join these sessions, her youth making her less inhibited about making mistakes. She had studied some English in school and found that her tongue remembered shapes it had learned years ago. Within 2 weeks, she could string together simple sentences, asking questions about ingredients and measurements. Tilly held back longer, her pride struggling against her curiosity, but eventually, she too began appearing in the kitchen doorway during lesson times. The breakthrough came when Coralie May invited Inga to actually help prepare a meal. She tied an apron around the German woman's waist, placed a knife in her hand, and guided her through dicing onions for a pot of soup. They worked side by side in companionable silence, broken only by occasional words. Onion. Cut. Good. Slowly, the kitchen became a neutral territory where the war felt distant and irrelevant, where two women from opposite sides of the world discovered they spoke the same language of care expressed through cooking. February 1945 brought the first letters from Germany, delivered through the International Red Cross, with official stamps and censor marks, obscuring portions of the text. Captain Holloway distributed them during evening roll call, his voice gentle as he called out names. Not every woman received a letter. Of the 23 German prisoners at Camp McCain, only 11 heard their names spoken that cold February evening. Inge was not among them. She watched as Rosa Klein tore open her envelope with trembling hands, watched as the young woman's face transformed from desperate hope to devastated relief. Her family in Nuremberg had survived, though their home had been damaged in bombing raids. Her father had lost his shop, her mother was working in a factory, her younger brother had been conscripted and was missing somewhere on the Eastern Front, but they were alive. Rosa clutched the letter to her chest and sobbed with a mixture of gratitude and grief that made the other women look away to give her privacy. Tilly Hoffmann received news from Berlin that was less fortunate. Her sister's husband had been killed in Russia. Her mother had died during an air raid in January. The family apartment building no longer existed. Her sister and two nieces were living in a church basement with dozens of other displaced families, surviving on rations that grew smaller each week. Tilly read the letter once, folded it carefully, and walked to her bunk without speaking. Her silence was more terrible than Rosa's tears. The women who received no letters faced a different kind of anguish. Inge spent the night lying awake, staring at the wooden slats of the bunk above her, wondering whether her parents in Leipzig were alive or dead, whether anyone she had known still existed in a world that seemed to be collapsing into rubble and ash. The not knowing felt worse than any definite answer might have been. The next morning, Coralie May noticed Inge's red-rimmed eyes and the mechanical way she moved through breakfast. Without asking questions, the cook prepared a special pot of tea using herbs she grew in a small garden behind the mess hall. She pressed the warm cup into Inge's hands and squeezed her shoulder with wordless compassion. Private First Class Henry Lawson, who had been teaching English vocabulary with such patience, brought Inge a book of poetry he had carried since basic training. He could not read German, but he understood the universal language of loss. That afternoon, Captain Holloway called a special assembly. He explained in simple English, which Rosa translated for those who still struggled with the language, that the Red Cross would continue searching for family members. He promised that every effort would be made to establish contact with their loved ones. But his face betrayed what his words did not say directly. Germany was being destroyed piece by piece, and the chances of finding intact families grew smaller with each passing day. Christmas Eve, 1944, arrived with unexpected warmth in Mississippi. The German women had been in Camp McCain for 3 weeks, long enough for the initial shock of captivity to fade into a strange new routine, but not long enough to forget what Christmas had meant in their former lives. Inge remembered her mother's stollen, the candlelit church services in Leipzig, the sound of carols drifting through snow-covered streets. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, to a woman who had believed she understood the world. Captain Holloway had given permission for the prisoners to decorate the mess hall using whatever materials they could find. Rosa Klein proved surprisingly artistic, folding paper into intricate snowflakes that caught the light from bare bulbs overhead. Tilly Hoffmann fashioned stars from tin cans that Coralie May had saved, her skilled hands transforming trash into something beautiful. Even the American Guards contributed, stringing popcorn and cranberries in the Southern tradition, teaching the German women this strange custom while laughing at their clumsy attempts to thread needles. But the decorations could not disguise the heaviness that settled over the camp as evening approached. These women were far from home, uncertain of their families' fates, facing a holiday that emphasized everything they had lost. Inge sat in the mess hall, watching snowflakes spin slowly on invisible threads, and felt emptiness so profound it seemed to hollow out her chest. Then Coralie May appeared in the doorway, not alone but accompanied by a dozen people from her church. They carried baskets covered with checkered cloths, and the smells that wafted from beneath those coverings made every German woman turn to look. The visitors were mostly older women, their faces weathered by sun and work, dressed in their Sunday best, despite the informal nature of the visit. They moved through the mess hall, setting out food with the efficiency of people who had organized countless church suppers. What appeared on those tables defied everything Inge thought she understood about war and enemies. There was fried chicken, golden and glistening. There were sweet potatoes candied with brown sugar and butter. There were greens cooked with ham hocks, cornbread still warm from the oven, and pies, so many pies, their crusts flaky and perfect. Apple, pecan, sweet potato, each one a masterpiece of Southern baking tradition. One of the church ladies, an elderly woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, approached Inge directly. She spoke slowly, her Mississippi accent thick but her intention clear. "Sugar, the Lord says we're supposed to feed the hungry. Don't matter much what uniform they're wearing. Y'all are somebody's daughters, far from home on Christmas. That ain't right, but we can make it a little less wrong." Inge's throat tightened. She managed to whisper, "Danke," then, "Thank you," the English words still awkward on her tongue. The old woman patted her hand and smiled, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted in Inge's understanding of what America meant. The church supper on Christmas Eve opened a door that no one could close again. In the weeks that followed, more visitors began appearing at Camp McCain, their curiosity gradually overcoming their initial hesitation about fraternizing with enemy prisoners. They came bearing small gifts, asking questions through translators, and slowly discovering that the German women were not the monsters propaganda had portrayed, but simply young people caught in circumstances beyond their control. Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair arrived on a cold January morning in a black Cadillac that seemed out of place against the rough dirt roads surrounding the camp. She was 58 years old, a widow who owned significant land holdings in the county, a woman whose wealth afforded her both influence and the freedom to act according to her conscience rather than popular opinion. Her only son, Lieutenant Thomas Sinclair, had been killed during the invasion of Sicily in 1943. She carried that loss in the set of her shoulders and the shadows beneath her eyes. Captain Holloway received her personally, aware that her support or opposition could shape community attitudes toward the camp. She stated her business plainly. She wished to meet the German prisoners, to see for herself what kind of women they were. She had read newspaper accounts, heard rumors from church ladies, and decided that second-hand information was insufficient for forming her own judgment. Inge was working in the kitchen with Coralie May when Mrs. Sinclair entered, her expensive shoes clicking against the concrete floor with authority. The wealthy woman surveyed the scene, taking in the sight of a German prisoner in an apron, chopping vegetables alongside an African-American cook, both women moving with the easy coordination of people who had found common ground in shared work. Coralie May made introductions in her warm, unhurried manner. Mrs. Sinclair extended her hand to Inge, a gesture of equality that seemed to surprise even Captain Holloway. Inge wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the handshake, meeting the older woman's gaze with a mixture of respect and uncertainty. What followed was a conversation conducted in halting English, with Coralie May occasionally helping to bridge gaps in understanding. Mrs. Sinclair asked about Inge's life before the war, her family, her work as a supply clerk. She listened with genuine attention, not interrupting, not judging, simply absorbing information and forming her own conclusions. When Inge mentioned that she had not heard from her parents in Leipzig, that she did not know if they had survived the bombing campaigns, Mrs. Sinclair's expression shifted into something recognizable. Grief understood grief, regardless of which side of the war it came from. Before leaving, Mrs. Sinclair made an unexpected announcement. She would be sponsoring a weekly English class at the camp, hiring a proper teacher, and providing books and materials. Any prisoner who wished to improve her language skills would be welcome to attend. It was not charity, she explained, but investment. These women would eventually return to Germany, and they should return as ambassadors of what America truly represented. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The news reached Camp McCain through radio broadcasts that crackled with static and jubilation. In cities across America, crowds filled the streets in celebration. Church bells rang, strangers embraced, and the relief of victory washed over a nation that had sacrificed so much for this moment. But in the prisoner of war camp outside McCain, Mississippi, the atmosphere was markedly different. The 23 German women gathered in the mess hall to hear Captain Holloway announce what they had known was inevitable. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. What should have been relief felt instead like standing at the edge of a cliff. Victory for America meant defeat for Germany, and defeat meant these women would soon be processed for repatriation to a homeland that no longer existed in any form they recognized. Captain Holloway explained the procedures with his characteristic kindness. They would be transferred to larger processing facilities, undergo medical examinations and security screenings, then transported back to Europe within the coming months. Ing listened to his words and felt panic rising in her chest. In the 6 months since arriving at Camp McCain, her world had been completely reconstructed. She had learned English well enough to think in it sometimes. She had discovered a talent for cooking under Coralie May's patient instruction. She had formed friendships with people she had been taught to hate, and those friendships had revealed the lies at the foundation of everything she had once believed. More than that, she had finally received a letter from Leipzig. Her father had died in a bombing raid in February. Her mother was living in a single room with 3 other families, surviving on rations that barely sustained life. The letter, written in her mother's shaking handwriting, painted a picture of a city destroyed, a country in ruins, a future that offered nothing but struggle and starvation. That evening, Inge found herself in the kitchen, with Coralie May, Rosa Klein, Tilly Hoffman, and 9 other women who had become more than fellow prisoners. They had become something like family. The conversation that unfolded would have been impossible to imagine 6 months earlier. Speaking in mixed German and English, they discussed the unthinkable. What if they asked to stay? Tilly was the first to voice it directly. "I have nothing to return to. My sister wrote that she wishes she could leave Germany, that there is no future there for anyone. Why should we go back to starve when we have found something here?" Rosa Klein, the youngest among them, nodded with tears streaming down her face. "My family told me not to come back yet. They said there is no food, no work, that young women are not safe in the occupied zones." The conversation continued late into the night, each woman wrestling with loyalty, guilt, hope, and fear. By morning, 13 of them had reached an impossible decision. Captain Holloway sat in stunned silence. As Ing stood before his desk, speaking in careful English that had improved dramatically over the months. Behind her, 12 other German women waited in the hallway, their presence a united front supporting a request that had no precedent in American military history. They did not wish to be repatriated to Germany. They wanted permission to remain in the United States as displaced persons. The captain had seen many unexpected things during his military career, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He asked Ing to repeat herself, certain he had misunderstood. But her words were clear, her intention unmistakable. She explained that they had been corresponding with their families, that they understood the conditions in occupied Germany, that returning would mean facing starvation, homelessness, and a society that viewed captured soldiers as failures and traitors. More than that, Inga continued, her voice growing stronger, they had discovered something in America that they wanted to be part of. They had experienced kindness where they expected cruelty, abundance where they anticipated deprivation, and dignity where they feared humiliation. They had learned that everything they had been taught about America was a lie, and they wanted the chance to build new lives in a country that had shown them what humanity could look like even between enemies. Captain Holloway promised to forward their request to his superiors, but he warned them that the decision would not be his to make. The War Department would need to be consulted, immigration authorities involved, and community approval secured. It could take months, and the answer might ultimately be no. The women accepted this uncertainty with the same quiet determination they had shown throughout their imprisonment. News of their request spread through McCain, Mississippi, like wildfire. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some townspeople were outraged, writing angry letters to the local newspaper, demanding that Nazi prisoners not be rewarded for their service to Hitler. They argued that American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific, that resources should go to veterans, not to enemy aliens who suddenly found American life comfortable. But others, particularly those who had visited the camp or attended church services where the German women had been present, defended them with surprising passion. Coralie May spoke at a town council meeting, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent months watching these women transform from frightened prisoners into hard-working members of the camp community. Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair wrote a lengthy editorial in the newspaper, pointing out that refusing redemption to those who genuinely sought it contradicted the Christian values the community claimed to uphold. Private First Class Henry Lawson, when asked by his commanding officer for his assessment, spoke plainly, "Sir, these women aren't our enemies anymore. Maybe they never really were. They were just people who believed the wrong things because they didn't know any better. Now they know better, and they want to do better." Seems to me that's exactly what we fought for. 3 months of bureaucratic limbo followed their unprecedented request. During that time, the 13 German women who wished to stay lived in a strange state of suspension, neither fully prisoners nor free citizens, waiting for authorities in Washington to decide their fate. They threw themselves into work with renewed intensity, as if their contributions might somehow tip the scales in their favor. Inga spent hours helping in the camp administrative office, her organizational skills and improving English making her invaluable. Rosa assisted in the infirmary, her gentle manner with sick and injured soldiers earning praise from the medical staff. Tilly worked in the motor pool, her mechanical aptitude solving problems that had frustrated American mechanics for weeks. The other 10 women, who had chosen repatriation, prepared for their return to Germany with a mixture of resignation and courage. They did not judge those who wished to stay, understanding that each woman faced impossible choices with no clear right answer. Some had received news that family members were alive and waiting for them. Others simply felt that their duty lay in helping rebuild their shattered homeland, regardless of personal cost. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered, bringing World War II to its final conclusion. 2 days later, Captain Holloway received the telegram he had been waiting for. The War Department, in consultation with the State Department and immigration authorities, had reached a decision regarding the 13 German women at Camp McCain. He called them into his office, his face unreadable. Inga's hands trembled as she translated his words for those whose English remained limited. The official position was complex, wrapped in legal language about displaced persons, enemy alien status, and exceptional circumstances. But the essence was clear. The women would not be forced to return to Germany immediately. They could remain in the United States under displaced person status, provided they could secure American sponsors willing to vouch for them, provide housing, and help them find employment. It was not citizenship, not permanent residency, not even a guarantee of a long-term future, but it was a chance, an opening, a possibility where none had existed before. The requirements were strict. Each woman would need an individual sponsor, preferably an American family of good standing. They would need to find work within 6 months. They would be monitored, their activities reported, their conduct scrutinized. Any violation of American law could result in immediate deportation. Before Captain Holloway finished explaining the conditions, Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair appeared in the doorway. She had been waiting in the outer office, having somehow learned that the decision would arrive that day. She looked directly at Inga and spoke words that would change both their lives forever. You'll stay with me. I have more rooms in my house than I know what to do with, and I could use help managing the estate. If you're willing to work hard and continue improving your English, you'll have a home for as long as you need one." 20 years later, spring 1965. Ing Sinclair stood in the kitchen of her restaurant in Jackson, Mississippi, supervising the evening preparations with the practiced eye of someone who had learned from the best. The establishment bore a name that honored both her heritage and her adopted home, the Bridge Cafe. On the menu, Southern comfort food sat alongside German specialties, each dish prepared with the same care and attention that Coralie May Washington had first demonstrated in a prison camp kitchen 2 decades earlier. The restaurant had become something of a local institution, known not just for its food but for the story behind it. Customers came to taste Inge's chicken and dumplings, which she had learned to make exactly as Coralie May had taught her, fluffy and perfect, swimming in rich golden broth. They came for her sauerbraten and spätzle, recipes her mother had sent from Leipzig in letters that arrived more regularly after Germany began its long recovery. But mostly they came because the Bridge Cafe represented something larger than food. It represented the possibility of transformation, of enemies becoming neighbors, of hatred giving way to understanding. Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair, now 78 years old and still sharp as ever, sat at her usual corner table, holding court with local ladies who had become her closest friends. She had never officially adopted Inge, but everyone in Jackson referred to the German woman as Evelyn's daughter, and neither of them corrected the assumption. The bond they had formed transcended legal definitions, built on mutual respect, shared grief, and the unexpected family they had created from the ruins of war. Rosa Klein had settled in nearby Hattiesburg, where she worked as a nurse at the county hospital. She had married an American veteran in 1952, a man who had fought in Europe and understood something about the complexity of war and the humanity of those on the other side. They had 3 children who grew up speaking both English and German, living proof that the next generation need not carry the hatreds of the previous one. Tilly Hoffman had chosen a different path. After 5 years in America, she had returned to Germany in 1950, carrying with her the lessons of reconciliation she had learned in Mississippi. She wrote to Inge regularly, describing her work with German-American friendship societies, helping to build bridges between the 2 nations that had once been mortal enemies. Her letters spoke of progress, of a Germany rebuilt, not just in brick and steel, but in values and commitment to human rights. Of the 13 women who had requested to stay, 9 had remained in America permanently. 4 had eventually returned to Germany after several years, taking with them stories of American kindness that helped reshape how their countrymen viewed their former enemies. All of them, whether they stayed or left, had become ambassadors of the possibility that simple acts of humanity could transcend the deepest divisions. Coralie May Washington had passed away in 1962, but her legacy lived on in every meal. Inge prepared, in every act of kindness she showed to strangers, in the understanding that a single bowl of chicken and dumplings could change the course of a life and prove that even enemies could become family.